We wrote according to our guide on Spring Security and didn't understand what you wrote about how it works. Now I will explain everything. Naturally, this video will be purely theoretical, meaning there will be no coding, no additions related to writing code. We will simply analyze the code that we wrote in the previous video about Spring Security with JWT tokens. So, let's get started. And the first thing we will discuss is the JWT service. We place the component annotation here because the component annotation indicates that this class is a Spring component that will be registered in the application context. Spring will manage its lifecycle and dependency injections. Next, we have a logger for recording logs, which is very useful for debugging and monitoring the application's performance. On the 21st, we perform an injection of the JWT secret variable value. The JWT secret stores the secret key that is used for signing the JWT. You can also see in this video how it was used in detail and at what stage the signing took place by following this prompt. There is still a small theoretical part, but it was there. Now let's move on. We have generateAlls token. This method, which creates the JWT token and the refresh token during our authorization, is exactly what we also talked about. That is, the JWT token with which we will navigate the endpoint, and the refresh token so that we can refresh our base token, because, for example, as we have it set up here, it will be valid for 1 minute. But let's say it will be valid for, I don't know, about 5 hours, while the refresh token will be valid for 1 day. Therefore, we will not need to authorize again, and we will be able to use the JWT token and the refresh token to access the endpoints. And this method refresh-based token is specifically written for refreshing the main token. Here we do not generate a refresh token, we simply refresh the main token. That is, we refresh the base token using refresh-based token. And here in the name, it's all quite obvious. Get email from token. It retrieves the email from the token. It takes the email from the token. In JWT, the email is usually stored in the subject field. For this, we use the JWTS library, a library that decodes and verifies the token using the JWT secret. Next, we have a method that checks the validity of the JWT token. If the token is valid and not expired, the method naturally returns true. Otherwise, it catches the corresponding exceptions and logs the error, returning false. Now let's move on to the private methods that we have written here. This method generates a base JWT token. According to ML, the JWTS library is used again to create the token, which signs the token using the JWT secret. And by the way, the subject, which we also discussed here, is how we extracted the ML from the token. Here we record it and here we extract it. Generate refresh token. Essentially the same, we just set, for example, the expiration time of this token a bit longer, and it serves as a refresh token. That's the whole difference. And perhaps the most interesting part, or maybe not, is getSyncInKey. This method returns the key for signing the JWT by decoding the value of the JWT secret variable, which we entered above, from base64 format, and creating the key using the HMAC algorithm. Accordingly, we can dive in here and read everything. So, if you find that you are missing some theoretical part even here, write the code or copy it from the repository. The link will also be in the description, as it was in the previous one. Download it, install it, and accordingly go through the documentation and read as well. Let's move on to the Custom User Service IMPL. We have implemented the User Detail Service. This is our Spring Security framework. So, if we dive into this interface, we will see that it has only one method. Again, everything is written in the documentation. Download and read. Accordingly, I will not explain user repository. If you have already written a Spring application, you understand perfectly well what user repository is for, what the service is for, and what required args constructor is for. So, the method load user by username. This method takes a username, which can be either an email or a login. Accordingly, it attempts to find it in the database. If it finds it, everything is fine. It maps it to custom user details and everything is good, and returns it. If it doesn't find one, it throws an exception stating that it couldn't find such a user. That's all. Everything is clear here. Also, there is such a thing as custom user details. Let's move on. Custom user details is a record class. A record class in Java is a special type of class designed for storing immutable data. Record classes automatically generate constructors, equals, hash code to string methods, as well as getters for fields. They provide a more concise and convenient way to create classes whose main task is to store data. When we write public record custom user details, we specify what object this class will contain, i.e., what object it will store within itself. In this specific case, it is a user object, which has a login, password, date of birth, and so on. But here we specifically define the logic get password, get username. If we need some authority, so to speak, then we need to think through the role system. Since I didn't have any role system, I naturally didn't set it up because it wasn't required for the basics. But if you study the documentation, it's actually not that difficult to implement it here. If you really need help and are having trouble, feel free to write in the comments, and I will explain how to do it with roles. Here I think everything is clear. Get password, get username, is account non-expired. It checks whether the user's account has expired, as it currently defaults to returning that it has not expired. Currently. Here, non-locked means that the account is not blocked. It is not blocked for us, accordingly. If we want to implement this logic here in some way, we just need to add the corresponding fields to the user class, and that's mostly it. He will check here, and we can also use this to verify who the user is later. If he is blocked there, we simply will not let him in. We can display a personal message to him saying that, sorry, your account is blocked. Well, this is just an example. Is credentials non-expired? Checks whether the credentials, such as the password, have expired. That can also happen. And you, once again, just add the corresponding fields. The enable field checks if the user is active. That is, if you need this in your application in any way, then feel free to add these fields. And here you simply write the logic of how it works. As for how it will work, it will just be retrieved from the user object. That's it. Just as it was done with the password, do the same here. So, next, let's move on to the JWT filter, because we have covered the custom user service simple and the JWT service. Now, let's proceed to the JWT filter. Again, I won't go into the annotations because I assume you are familiar with them, but if it's really necessary, we can release a separate video on Spring even, if it's really needed. Our JWT filter extends from the onSpareRequest filter. So, what is the onSpareRequest filter? This is the base class for Spring Security filters, which should be executed once for each request. This ensures that the filter will be processed only once, regardless of how many internal requests may occur during the processing of the main request. Do filter internal the get token from request. I think you understand. Takes the token from the request. We will discuss this method later. Token verification. If the token exists and successfully passes the validity check using the JWT service validate, the JWT token, the filter extracts user information from the token and sets it in the Spring Security context. So we have this method set custom user details to security context holder, which essentially sets the security context. And what essentially happens next, filter chain do filter, the request response passes control to the next filter in the chain. If the token is invalid or missing, the request simply continues down the chain and authentication processing does not occur. Next, we have set custom user details to security context holder. Set custom user details to security context holder. I won't explain this method. It's clear that we are again getting the email from the token. Here we take user data from the database, finding it by email or by username, whichever you prefer as you need. In this specific case, I am using the email. Next, we create an authentication object using the loaded user data. This object stores information about the current authentication and the user's access rights. Next, we set the authentication in the security context, security context holder, .get context. Set authentication sets the created authentication object in the current Spring Security context. After this, the user information will be available throughout the application. The getTokenFromRequest method extracts the JWT token from the authorization header in the HTTP request. If the header is present and starts with bearer, the token itself is returned, removing the bearer prefix. If the token is absent or the header does not match the expected format, it returns null. So, let's move on to the next class, Security Config. The Enable Web Security annotation enables web security in the application and allows us to configure the components of Spring Security. Enable Method Security enables method security support for managing access at the individual method level. Next, we use the JWT filter here, which I think is quite clear. So the security filter chain method, this method is actually needed to configure access. In simpler terms, here we configure where the user can access and where the user cannot access. Roles will also be configured here. Again, if you have any issues with setting up roles in Spring Security, please mention it in the comments and we will look into it. At the very least, we will try. So, what are we doing here? Pass struct http.configure disable http basic.abstract http.configure disable. We disable basic authentication because we use JWT for authentication instead of sessions and cookies. esrf.abstract.http.configure.disable. Here we disable the protection against cross-site request forgery, as it is not required when using JWT. Authorize HTTP requests. Here we define the authorization rules for various endpoints. For example, we say that for the user registration and ALS endpoints, as well as all the others that follow ALS, we allow unauthenticated users access to these endpoints. For all other endpoints, we require authentication. What happens on this line? Here we set the session management policy to be stateless. This means that sessions will not be used and each request will be processed independently, which is typical for applications using JWT. Add filter before. I think you already understand what we are doing here. We add our filter before this filter, the username password authentication filter class. This is a Spring Security filter. We need the data to pass through our filter before it goes through the username password authentication filter. http.build completes the configuration and creates a security filter chain object. Here we create an instance of bcrypt password encoder, which is a secure and reliable method used for safely hashing and storing passwords. In this case, the hashing strength is set to 4, which indicates a moderate level of hashing complexity. Moreover, if we delve into the bcrypt password encoder, we will see that the default value is 10, which means it is even stronger, but we don't need that, so we set it to 4. This is a moderate strength for password hashing. Well, I think that's all for now because basically it's already clear how it works. I showed how it works through Postman. I hope it was interesting, and I hope it has become clearer what we have written here. If you noticed that I missed something, or if there's anything else you don't understand, please write about it in the comments and we will address it. Either Google it or read the documentation. This can also help. It is a very useful skill. If you discover the joy of reading the documentation, that would be great. Thank you all for your attention. Goodbye, everyone.